It's just common sense, Emily. I'm the one who can carry the family name forward, and that means the properties need to be under my control. All 11 of them. It's already decided. Jason's voice didn't shake. That was the first thing I noticed. He said it with a flat, terrifyingly casual tone, as if he were discussing the weather or the price of the rotisserie chicken sitting on the plastic tray between us. We were in my parents' basement, a place of wood-paneled walls and old memories, sitting on mismatched folding chairs that creaked every time someone shifted their weight. The air was thick with the scent of iced tea and the faint, metallic tang of the unfinished utility room nearby. My brother leaned back, his hands laced behind his head, looking at me with a mixture of pity and triumph. He wasn't looking for a discussion. He was delivering a verdict. I looked at my parents. My father was staring intently at a paper plate covered in the remains of some macaroni salad, his fork tracing patterns in the leftover mayo. My mother was busy smoothing out a plastic tablecloth, her eyes fixed on a stray crumb. They were silent. That silence was a physical weight in the room, a thick, suffocating blanket that told me everything I needed to know. They weren't going to fight for me. They were going to let the natural order of things take place, even if it meant erasing the last 10 years of my life. My Aunt Sarah cleared her throat, the sound echoing off the low ceiling. She reached for a soda can, the tab clicking open with a sharp snap that made everyone jump except for Jason. He just kept staring at me, waiting for the explosion. He wanted me to scream about the duplexes on Elm Street. He wanted me to cry about the ranch houses I had spent my weekends painting and the tenants whose names he didn't even know. He wanted me to be their emotional sister so he could play the level-headed brother. I didn't give it to him. I watched the way the fluorescent light glinted off his watch. I noticed the small grease stain on his polo shirt. I stayed perfectly still, my hands resting folded in my lap. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable for everyone else, until my uncle shifted and my mom finally looked up with a pleading expression. Jason's smirk widened, thinking he had paralyzed me with his boldness. He thought he had won because he spoke first and he spoke loudest. He didn't realize that I wasn't silent because I was shocked. I was silent because I was calculating. Slowly, I let a small, steady smile touch my lips. I didn't say a word. I just let that smile sit there, unexplained and cold, until the confidence in Jason's eyes began to flicker with the first shadow of a doubt. To Jason, the 11 properties were just addresses on a spreadsheet, line items of potential wealth he could use to fund a life he hadn't earned. But to me, they were the map of my entire existence. As the silence in the basement stretched, my mind drifted back to the grit and the grime of the last decade. Jason hadn't been there when the pipes froze at the Elm Street duplex during the polar vortex of 2014. He was in California then, sending postcards about finding his center while I was in a crawlspace at 4 a.m., my fingers numb, wrapped around a blowtorch, praying the copper wouldn't burst. My father had bought that duplex the year I turned 10. I remember holding the flashlight for him, the way the damp earth smelled under the floorboards, and the way he told me that a house is a living thing. It breathes, it ages, and it needs someone to listen to its heartbeat. Jason never listened. He was always too busy looking at the horizon to see what was right beneath his feet. While he was bouncing from one failed startup to another, I was the one who showed up at the Miller Street Ranch every first of the month. I knew the tenants by their first names. I knew that Mrs. Gable at number 42 liked her privacy but needed help changing her air filters because her arthritis was getting worse. I knew that the young couple in the blue house on Harrison were struggling, so I let them slide on the late fees as long as they kept the lawn manicured. I wasn't just collecting envelopes of cash or checks, I was the custodian of their lives. I was the one who took the calls about leaking water heaters on Christmas Eve while my parents sat by the fireplace, blissfully unaware of the chaos. Every repair was a withdrawal from my own life and a deposit into these structures. I've painted every single wall in those 11 units. I know the exact shade of Navajo white that hides the scuffs in the hallways. I've scrubbed mold-off bathroom tiles until my knuckles bled. I've spent my Saturdays at the local hardware store, arguing about the price of plywood and searching for the specific washers that fit the outdated faucets in the inherited properties. My parents had long ago checked out, their energy drained by age and a desire for a quiet retirement. They handed me the ledger when I was 24 and said, "Emily, just keep it running." And I did. I kept it running through recessions, through tenant turnovers, and through the years of Jason's expensive absences. These homes weren't just investments. They were the physical manifestation of my sweat and my patience. The shingles on the roof of the Oak Street house were paid for by the bonus I earned at my day job. The new furnace on Fifth Avenue was the reason I didn't go on a vacation for 3 years. I didn't mind, because I thought I was building something for all of us. I thought I was securing a legacy. Standing there in the basement, looking at the grease from the rotisserie chicken on Jason's fingers, it hit me with a devastating clarity. These houses hadn't just been my work. They had raised me. They had taught me how to be resilient, how to be silent, and how to wait. They were part of my skin and bone, and Jason thought he could just reach out and pluck them like fruit from a tree he had never watered. Jason leaned forward, his elbows hitting the oak table with a heavy thud that made the half-empty soda cans rattle. He had this way of tilting his head, a practiced look of sincere concern that he used whenever he was about to deliver a blow. "Look, Emily," he said, his voice dropping into a register he probably thought sounded statesmanlike. "I know you've been helping out around here while I was away. I appreciate that. Truly. But we have to look at the big picture. Dad always said that these properties were meant to be a legacy, a business. And a business needs a firm hand at the helm. It needs someone who understands the market, not just someone who knows how to fix a leaky faucet." I felt the air in the room shift. With those few sentences, he was attempting to erase a decade of my life. He was reframing my years of labor as helping out, as if I were a teenager doing chores for an allowance rather than the woman who had kept the family's entire financial portfolio from collapsing. He started using these phrases, "Dad always said," and "Grandpa's vision," weaving a narrative out of thin air. He talked about expanding the portfolio and leveraging the equity, buzzwords he had likely picked up from a weekend seminar or a YouTube video. He spoke as if he had been right there beside me in the trenches, as if he had shared the burden of the property taxes and the midnight emergencies. Jason saw their lack of resistance and doubled down. "I've already looked into some management software," he continued, his tone growing more expansive, more entitled by the second. "We need to modernize. The way things have been run, it's just not sustainable. It's been too emotional, too small town. Dad always told me he wanted a son to take this to the next level." My father didn't even flinch at the lie. He just stared at the crumbs on his plate, his silence acting as a seal of approval on Jason's rewritten history. It was a betrayal that stung worse than Jason's greed. I realized then that their silence wasn't neutral. It was the fuel Jason needed to burn my work to the ground. They were enabling the theft of my life's work because it was the path of least resistance. I watched my brother's smug face and realized that for years, my own silence, my habit of just doing the work without asking for credit, had paved the way for this moment. I had been so busy building the house that I hadn't noticed him stealing the deed. The basement light flickered, casting long, jittery shadows against the walls covered in old family photos. I looked around the table, searching for one pair of eyes that would meet mine, one person who would acknowledge the absurdity of what was happening. My Aunt Linda was busy picking at a loose thread on her sweater, her head bowed as if she were in deep prayer. My Uncle Mike, a man who usually had an opinion on everything from the local high school football team to the price of lumber, was suddenly fascinated by the label on his soda can, peeling it back with meticulous, trembling precision. They were all there, a dozen people who had watched me grow up, who had seen me covered in drywall dust and grease for years, and not one of them was willing to break the unspoken rule of the Carter family, never cause a scene. The air felt thin, recycled. I could hear the hum of the old refrigerator in the corner, a steady, rhythmic throb that seemed to sync with the pounding in my temples. Jason was still talking, his voice rising in pitch as he felt the silent assent of the room. He was talking about streamlining and efficiency, words that sounded hollow coming from a man who had never even mowed the lawn of a rental, let alone managed a tenant dispute. But the family was nodding. It was a slow, rhythmic movement, a collective swaying of heads that felt like a funeral march. They weren't nodding because they believed him. They were nodding because his lie was easier to live with than my truth. If Jason was in charge, the status quo remained. If Jason took the properties, they didn't have to feel guilty about the fact that they had never stepped in to help me. I felt a cold, sharp sense of isolation settle in my chest, a realization that I was a stranger in my own bloodline. I was the one who had kept the peace for so long by being the reliable one, the one who never complained, the one who just handled it. And now, that reliability was being used as a weapon against me. My mother finally looked up, but her eyes didn't hold support. They held a plea. She was begging me with her gaze to just let it go, to not make this difficult for everyone. She wanted me to sacrifice my future so she could finish her sheet cake in peace. It was a devastating betrayal, wrapped in the guise of maternal concern. I saw the relief on my father's face when I didn't immediately jump up and scream. He actually looked relaxed, his shoulders dropping an inch as he realized there wouldn't be a confrontation. Not tonight, not in front of the relatives. The urge to scream was there, a hot, jagged stone in my throat. I wanted to stand up and list every single dollar I had spent, every hour I had lost, and every lie Jason had told in the last 20 minutes. I wanted to flip the table and watch the paper plates fly. But I didn't. I looked at Jason's smug, sweating face and I realized that if I fought him now, I would lose. In this room, with these people, he was the hero of his own story, and I was just the bitter sister who couldn't let go. If I wanted to win, I couldn't do it with words. I had to let them all believe they had succeeded. I had to let the silence finish its work. I reached for my glass of iced tea, my hand perfectly steady, and took a slow sip. I chose restraint, not out of weakness, but because I knew that the loudest person in the room is rarely the one who actually holds the power. As the conversation shifted toward Jason's grand vision for the summer maintenance schedule, a schedule I had already completed 3 weeks ago, I felt a strange, icy calm settle over me. My brother was currently explaining to my uncle Mike how he planned to renegotiate the vendor contracts to save money. He was talking about the plumbers and electricians I had known since I was a teenager, men who showed up for me in the middle of a blizzard because they knew the Carters always paid on time and with a handshake that meant something. Jason didn't realize that these men worked for *me*, not for the name on the mailbox. He didn't understand that loyalty isn't a line item you can simply transfer to a new ledger. I sat there, my hands folded neatly over my napkin, and I let my mind drift back to the quiet hours I'd spent in my own home over the last 3 years. While Jason was bouncing between cities and finding himself, I had been sitting at my small kitchen table with a lamp and a mountain of manila folders. I remembered the night I realized our grandfather's original trust had a sunset clause, a detail my parents had overlooked when they grew tired of the paperwork. I remembered the day I sat down with a local real estate attorney, a woman who specialized in family succession, and asked her a single, pointed question: what happens if one heir performs all the fiduciary duties without compensation for a decade? I never argued with Jason about who did more work because I knew that in the eyes of the law, work is just words until it's documented. I had every receipt for every bag of mulch, every property tax bill I'd covered when the rental income fell short, and every city permit I'd pulled in my own name because my father was too overwhelmed to go down to the courthouse. I had been building a fortress out of paper while Jason was building a castle out of sand. I remembered a conversation I had with my father 2 years ago, on a quiet Sunday while we were looking at the roof of the Fifth Avenue duplex. He had sighed, his eyes tired, and said, "Emily, I don't know what I'd do without you. You're the only one who cares about these places." I had recorded that date in my journal. I had saved the email where he told me he was leaving the logistics entirely in my hands. Jason was now gesturing wildly, his voice growing more boisterous as he realized no one was going to stop him. He was already spending the equity in his head, talking about a new car and a management fee he'd be taking off the top each month. He was so blinded by the immediate gratification of his power play that he never stopped to ask where the actual deeds were kept. He never stopped to ask why the city utility bills were addressed to me personally. He assumed that because he was the son, the path would be cleared for him by divine right. He thought he was playing a game of checkers, where the loudest player wins by jumping the most pieces. He had no idea I had been playing a much longer, much quieter game. As I looked at him across the table, past the sweating sheet cake and the crumpled napkins, I realized the most dangerous thing about Jason wasn't his greed. It was his assumption that I was as unprepared as he was. Jason was claiming the throne, but he had no idea that I had already changed the locks on the kingdom. Jason caught my eye across the table, and when he saw my smile hadn't wavered, his chest expanded even further. He didn't see a woman who was 3 steps ahead of him. He saw a sister who had finally been broken. He interpreted my silence as the white flag of surrender, the quiet submission of a woman who had realized she was outmatched by his masculine resolve. He let out a short, sharp laugh and leaned over to pat my hand, a gesture so condescending it made my skin crawl. "I'm glad you're being so mature about this, he said, his voice dripping with a fake, oily warmth. "I know it's a big change, but it's for the best. You've worked hard, and now you can finally just relax. Let me handle the heavy lifting. I've already got a buyer interested in the Miller Street properties. We can liquidate those, clear the debt, and really start fresh." The room went deathly still for a heartbeat. My father's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a sudden, sharp flicker of alarm. The Miller Street houses were the crown jewels of the family's modest empire, 3 perfectly maintained ranches that had been paid off for 15 years. They were the primary source of my parents' monthly cash flow. But Jason didn't notice the tension he'd just created. He was too intoxicated by his own momentum. He began to talk faster, revealing the rot at the core of his plan. He spoke about rebranding the family business and how he had already looked into taking out a massive line of credit against the Elm Street duplexes to fund a tech-integrated rental startup he wanted to launch in the city. He was dismantling our grandfather's legacy in real time, right there between the paper plates and the cooling barbecue trays. The more he talked, the more the family's relief began to sour into a quiet, creeping dread. I watched my Aunt Sarah's hand pause on its way to the apple pie. I saw my father's knuckles turn white as he gripped the edge of the oak table. Jason was exposing himself, showing everyone in the room that he didn't care about the family, the tenants, or the history of the houses. He only cared about the exit strategy. He was a predator who had finally been given the keys to the enclosure, and he was already picking out which parts to eat first. He started listing the dead weight he intended to cut, mentioning long-term tenants by their unit numbers rather than their names, describing them as obstacles to market rate optimization. I didn't stop him. I didn't point out that the Miller Street properties couldn't be sold because of a specific clause I'd helped my father draft into the family trust 3 years ago. I didn't mention that the debt he wanted to clear was actually a low-interest maintenance loan I had already paid off with the previous year's profits. I just kept that same, steady smile on my face, nodding occasionally as if I were taking it all in. I wanted him to keep talking. I wanted every word to be witnessed by the aunts and uncles who had sat in silence while he claimed his throne. I wanted his greed to be so loud, so undeniable, that no one could ever claim they didn't see it coming. I sat back and watched as my brother, fueled by the intoxicating belief that he had already won, methodically built the case against himself. I waited until Jason paused to take a triumphant, final gulp of his iced tea, his face flushed with the heat of his own performance. The silence that followed wasn't the respectful kind he expected. It was the hollow, vibrating quiet of a family realizing they had just handed the car keys to a drunk driver. Slowly, deliberately, I reached down to the floor and picked up my leather messenger bag. The brass buckles made a crisp, metallic sound as I undid them, a sharp contrast to the dull rustle of the paper plates. I didn't rush. I didn't stand up. I simply pulled out a thick, navy blue binder, its spine labeled with the current year in my precise, blocky handwriting. I set it on the oak table, right in the middle of the grease stains and the crumbs of the sheet cake. "Jason," I said, my voice low and steady, cutting through the basement air like a cooling breeze. "I've been listening to your vision for the Miller Street properties. It's ambitious." I flipped the binder open. The pages were protected by plastic sleeves, filled with notarized documents, bank statements, and tax returns. I turned the binder toward my father, who was still staring at his hands. "The thing is, Dad, we don't have to worry about the market rate optimization Jason mentioned. Because according to the management agreement you signed with me 4 years ago, the one that granted me power of attorney over the operational assets in exchange for covering the 2021 back taxes, these properties cannot be sold without the primary manager's consent for 20 years. The room went cold. I saw Jason's eyes dart to the binder. He tried to laugh, a shaky, dismissive sound. "What are you talking about? That's just paperwork, Emily." Dad didn't, but he stopped when I slid a single sheet of paper toward him. It was a copy of the deed for the Elm Street duplex. At the bottom, next to my father's shaky signature, was mine. Not as an observer, but as a minority stakeholder with right of first refusal. I had bought into the properties, one repair at a time, one tax bill at a time, documenting every cent as a capital contribution rather than a gift. I had the ledger entries showing that the family money Jason thought was just sitting there had actually been my personal savings for nearly a decade. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I simply walked them through the timeline. I showed them the dates, the months Jason was in Bali while I was paying the property insurance from my own account, the year he was in Austin while I was filing the LLC renewals that he didn't even know existed. I showed them the receipts for the roofs, the furnaces, and the windows. I presented the truth as a series of indisputable facts, laid out in chronological order. Documents don't care about volume. They don't care about who is the eldest son or who has the loudest voice at a barbecue. They only care about what is signed, sealed, and delivered. Jason's face transitioned from a smug red to a sickly, pale gray. He reached for the binder, his fingers trembling, but I placed my hand firmly on the cover. I wasn't celebrating. I wasn't gloating. I was simply presenting the reality he had spent the last hour trying to ignore. I knew then that the fight wasn't coming. The fight was already over. I had spent years building a paper trail that led to this exact moment of absolute, quiet certainty. The change in Jason was physical. It started at the corners of his eyes, which began to twitch with a rhythmic, nervous energy he couldn't suppress. The boastful, expansive posture he had maintained all evening began to collapse inward, his shoulders hunching as he stared at the navy blue binder. He didn't reach for the documents again. Instead, he pulled his hand back as if the paper were hot to the touch. The silence in the basement, which had previously been a tool for his dominance, was now turning against him. It was no longer a vacuum for him to fill with his voice. It was a courtroom, and the jury was finally waking up. He looked at my father, desperate for a lifeline, but my father was now leaning forward, his glasses perched on the end of his nose, squinting at the notarized seal on the top page. The emotional aftermath wasn't an explosion, it was a slow, steady cooling. I watched my Aunt Sarah start to clear the table, her movements efficient and silent, as if she were trying to erase the last hour. My father reached over and patted my hand, not a patronizing gesture like Jason's, but a heavy, apologetic touch that spoke of 1,000 things he would never have the courage to say out loud. He knew I had saved him from Jason, and he knew I had done it by being smarter than the family he had raised. I felt a strange sense of relief for Jason, too. By taking away the properties he wasn't equipped to manage, I had saved him from the inevitable collapse of his own ego. He wouldn't see it that way tonight, or perhaps ever, but that was no longer my problem to solve. I stood up and began to pack my binder back into my bag. Ownership was redefined in that moment. It wasn't about who could declare themselves king in a basement. It was about who had the keys and the character to hold them. I looked at the cold rotisserie chicken and the sweat on the Costco cake, and I realized I wasn't hungry anymore. I was full. I was satisfied. I had walked into this house as the daughter who did the chores, and I was leaving as the woman who held the future. As I zipped my bag, I felt a deep, resonant peace settle over me. The storm had passed, the truth had outlasted the ego, and for the first time in my life, the silence wasn't a cage. It was my sanctuary. I walked out of my parents' house that night into the cool, damp air of an Ohio evening. The streetlights flickered to life, casting a soft, amber glow over the suburban driveways and the meticulously kept lawns. For the first time in a decade, the air didn't feel heavy with the expectation of a disaster I had to prevent. I got into my car, the leather seat familiar and grounding, and I sat there for a moment with my hands on the wheel. I looked at the dark windows of the house I had just left, knowing that inside, the debris of the family meeting was being swept into trash bags, and the silence was being filled with the uncomfortable murmurs of people who had finally seen behind the curtain. Jason would eventually leave. He would drive back to his apartment, fueled by a new kind of resentment, spinning a story where he was the victim of a calculated legal ambush. My parents would go to bed, exhausted by the reality they could no longer ignore. But the properties, those 11 collections of brick, wood, and history, remained. Tomorrow morning, I would wake up and check the weather forecast for the Elm Street duplex. I would call the plumber for the Harrison house to follow up on a minor leak. I would do the work, just as I always had. The difference was that now, everyone knew why I was doing it. Legacy is not a declaration made over a Costco sheet cake. It isn't a title handed down because of a birth certificate or a loud voice. Legacy is the quiet, persistent work of showing up when the pipes freeze, when the taxes are due, and when the people inside those houses need a roof that doesn't leak. It is built in the shadows, in the ledgers, and in the thousands of tiny, invisible choices to do the right thing when no one is watching. Jason thought ownership was a destination he could reach by shouting. I knew it was a journey I had been walking for years. I put the car in reverse and backed slowly down the driveway, the gravel crunching under my tires. I felt a profound sense of closure, a settling of accounts that went far beyond money or real estate. I had protected my grandfather's dream, my parents' retirement, and my own future. I had done it without a single scream, without a single insult, and without ever losing my composure. I had simply waited for the truth to catch up to the ego, and in the end, the truth was the only thing left standing. The loudest person in the room is often just a distraction from the person who actually holds the keys.